William George Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in Connecticut but later moved to Southern California, where he would eventually earn one of the most feared monikers in true crime history, the Freeway Killer. His early life was marked by instability. Raised in a deeply troubled home, he was exposed to a violent environment from an early age. With a father battling alcoholism and a mother frequently absent, Bonin was placed in a juvenile detention center by the time he was a teenager. It was there, behind locked doors meant for rehabilitation, that Bonin reportedly endured repeated abuse. These traumatic early experiences likely contributed to the violent behavior he would later exhibit, though nothing could have predicted the magnitude of the crimes he would commit. Bonin served in the U.S. Air Force during the Vietnam War, where he earned medals for his service. When he returned to civilian life in California, he initially blended in with society, holding jobs and maintaining a low profile. However, his criminal behavior resurfaced in 1968 when he was arrested for sexually assaulting multiple minors. Psychological assessments deemed him a high-risk offender, and he was institutionalized for years through sentencing. Despite numerous warnings from medical professionals that he was dangerous, Bonin was released. In May 1979, police found the body of a young man near a freeway off-ramp. At the time, it was treated as an isolated homicide. But over the following year, a disturbing pattern emerged. Dozens of boys and young men, many of them teenagers, were turning up dead along major Southern California highways. Law enforcement began to realize they were dealing with a serial offender who was targeting vulnerable individuals and discarding them near roadways. The press gave him a chilling title, the Freeway Killer. Bonin's method was consistent. He cruised neighborhoods in a van, looking for young people who appeared alone or in need of a ride. He gained their trust through offers of transportation, favors, or companionship. But once inside the vehicle, things turned dark. What followed was a sustained pattern of violence. His victims were often restrained, abused, and then killed. The circumstances were tragic, and the evidence showed that the attacks were carefully orchestrated. The authorities were overwhelmed. Many of Bonin's victims were runaways or youths with unstable home lives, which delayed their disappearance reports. This allowed Bonin to operate largely unnoticed. The killings continued without interruption, each one bearing a similar signature, each body found near a highway, often within a day of the person vanishing. His crimes spanned multiple counties, making it harder for law enforcement agencies to connect the dots. Bonin was not acting alone in many of the murders. Over the course of his crimes, he enlisted the help of at least 4 accomplices. One of them was Vernon Butts, a man with a fascination for the macabre. Court documents later tied Butts to a dozen of the homicides. While awaiting trial in 1981, Butts died in custody, never facing the full extent of the law. Another of Bonin's accomplices, a teenager named Gregory Miley, admitted to assisting in multiple attacks. Like Butts, Miley had been drawn into Bonin's orbit through a mix of manipulation and shared malice. The presence of accomplices added a disturbing dimension to the case. It wasn't just one individual, but a network of willing participants. In total, Bonin is believed to have killed at least 21 victims between 1979 and 1980, although he was convicted of 14. His crimes were shocking not just because of their volume but because of the detailed planning and repeated cruelty involved. The fact that he continued killing for so long, even as the media spotlight intensified, spoke to his boldness and the gaps in interagency communication at the time. The entire region was gripped by fear. Communities were on edge. Youths were warned against hitchhiking, and parents became increasingly cautious. The Freeway Killer dominated headlines, yet Bonin still roamed free, confident that he would not be caught. His van, a plain, unremarkable vehicle, allowed him to blend in with the thousands of others on California's highways. Inside, however, it became the scene of unspeakable horror. Eventually, a mistake would lead to his downfall. Investigators, working with survivor testimony and mounting forensic evidence, began to narrow in on suspects. Bonin's name came up more than once. He had prior convictions and a criminal record that raised red flags. As surveillance teams closed in, what they uncovered would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. Bonin's arrest would open the floodgates to a harrowing investigation, one that exposed journals, confessions, and a timeline of violence that spanned over a decade. The true depth of his crimes would only become clear during his trial, where he was described by the prosecution as the most arch-evil person who ever existed. By the spring of 1980, pressure was mounting on Southern California law enforcement. The body count was rising, and the public was growing restless. Young men were vanishing at an alarming rate, and the press had fully embraced the moniker Freeway Killer. There was panic in communities across Los Angeles and Orange counties. While parents clutched their children tighter and teens began avoiding hitchhiking altogether, police quietly ramped up their efforts behind the scenes. A breakthrough came in June 1980. Detectives had begun surveillance on William Bonin after he was mentioned by multiple informants familiar with his past. His name was already in police files for prior offenses involving young boys, and the details of those convictions drew a troubling parallel to the current string of murders. Investigators tailed him for days. On June 11, Bonin was seen picking up a teenage boy. Officers watched as the van parked in a secluded area, and what they witnessed confirmed their worst fears. They intervened just in time to prevent another tragedy. Inside the van, the boy was found alive but shaken. The scene was disturbing. Ropes, duct tape, and other instruments of control lay scattered. Bonin was arrested on the spot. What began as a single arrest soon unraveled into a sprawling investigation. A search of Bonin's van and residence yielded damning evidence. Police found personal items belonging to several missing boys, along with implements used in his crimes. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but it was Bonin's own words that would seal his fate. In custody, Bonin didn't remain silent. Over the course of several interviews, he calmly confessed to a staggering number of murders, 21 in total. He offered chilling details about how he chose his victims, describing the planning that went into each attack. The killings, he said, gave him a sense of excitement. He spoke without remorse, recounting each case with disturbing clarity, as if listing items on a grocery bill. Bonin even identified specific locations where bodies had been dumped, areas so remote that authorities had not yet discovered them. His confessions led investigators to remains that had gone unnoticed for months. He also named several of his accomplices, exposing a network of enablers who had either assisted directly or witnessed the aftermath of his crimes. Among them was James Munro, a younger man who had spent time living with Bonin. Munro initially denied involvement, but under questioning, he admitted to helping Bonin with at least one killing. Another accomplice, William Pugh, told authorities that Bonin had casually confessed to murder during a car ride and had even invited him to participate. Pugh declined but never reported the conversation. Then there was Vernon Butts, Bonin's closest partner in violence. Butts was already in custody when Bonin was arrested. He confessed to assisting in multiple murders and provided investigators with intimate knowledge of the crimes. Yet before he could stand trial, Butts took his own life in jail, hanging himself with a bedsheet. With him went valuable testimony that might have further illuminated the full scope of Bonin's activities. As charges were filed, the weight of the case was unprecedented. Bonin was eventually indicted for 14 murders across multiple jurisdictions. Prosecutors decided to try him in both Los Angeles and Orange counties, ensuring no victim's case was overlooked. He was also charged with kidnapping, robbery, and multiple counts of sexual assault. The total number of charges was staggering. Bonin's trial began in Los Angeles in 1981. The courtroom was tense, packed with journalists, families of victims, and the curious public. The prosecution laid out a devastating timeline, supported by physical evidence, Bonin's own admissions, and testimony from his accomplices. One of the key moments came when jurors were shown maps charting the distances between where victims were last seen and where they were discovered. The precision of Bonin's movements suggested careful planning rather than random violence. Psychiatrists who had evaluated Bonin during earlier incarcerations were also called to testify. They confirmed that he had been labeled a high-risk offender before his release years earlier. Their testimony raised painful questions about why someone so clearly dangerous had been granted freedom. The trial became not only a prosecution of Bonin but also an indictment of a system that had allowed him to slip through the cracks. Bonin's defense team struggled to present an alternative narrative. They didn't deny that he had killed but argued that mental illness played a role in his actions. The jury remained unmoved. After weeks of graphic testimony and overwhelming evidence, they returned a verdict in early 1982. Bonin was found guilty on 10 counts of murder in Los Angeles County. Shortly afterward, a separate jury in Orange County convicted him of 4 additional murders. The sentence was clear: death. Bonin showed little emotion as the verdicts were read. In interviews following his convictions, he expressed no regret for his actions. In fact, he told reporters that he enjoyed the act of killing and would have continued if he hadn't been caught. With the sentences handed down, Bonin was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. He would spend the next 14 years on death row. During this time, he wrote numerous letters, gave interviews, and even crafted a memoir-like account of his crimes, further solidifying his legacy as a remorseless killer. While Bonin awaited his fate, families of the victims tried to move forward, though the scars ran deep. Each courtroom photograph, each news article, each appeal hearing brought their pain back into focus. For them, justice had been delayed, but it was no longer denied. For William Bonin, life on death row at San Quentin State Prison was devoid of remorse. Confined to a small cell in California's oldest penitentiary, he filled his time with writing, interviews, and appeals. While most inmates lived in quiet anticipation of the inevitable, Bonin remained oddly visible, continuing to correspond with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and even pen pals from around the world who were drawn to his notoriety. He became the embodiment of public fascination with serial killers, one of the rare few who admitted guilt without attempting to shift blame. In letters, he described his actions in cold, clinical terms. In taped interviews, he spoke with an unsettling calmness, often delving into the details of his crimes with no hint of guilt. He didn't seek forgiveness. He didn't ask for redemption. Instead, Bonin leaned into his reputation, almost relishing the attention his crimes had brought him. He was, in his own mind, already infamous. Bonin's legal team filed multiple appeals over the years, arguing procedural errors, ineffective counsel, and cruel and unusual punishment. But the courts, after reviewing the extensive evidence and confessions, consistently upheld his conviction and sentence. Each failed appeal further solidified his fate. By 1995, after nearly a decade and a half behind bars, the state of California was preparing to carry out its first execution since the death penalty was reinstated in 1977. Bonin, now graying and slower than the man who once prowled the freeways, had become a central figure in a renewed debate over capital punishment. Opponents of the death penalty protested outside the gates of San Quentin. Supporters of the victims, along with families of those murdered by Bonin, called for the state to follow through. For many of those who had lost sons, brothers, and friends, the years had not dulled their pain. They had waited long enough. Some families sent statements to the governor's office, urging the execution to proceed without further delay. The final hours of Bonin's life passed in grim routine. He was informed of the schedule. He chose his last meal, 2 pepperoni and sausage pizzas, Coca-Cola, and coffee. He made no request for a final statement and declined the presence of a spiritual advisor. It was in character. Bonin had never expressed interest in redemption. On February 23, 1996, at 12:13 a.m., William George Bonin was executed by lethal injection. The method was notable. He was the first inmate in California to be executed using this technique. The room was sterile, silent, watched by selected witnesses behind a glass window. Among them were members of the victims' families. They had waited over 15 years for this moment. His death was swift. Witnesses reported no struggle, no visible reaction, no emotion. Just like his crimes, methodical and cold. With his passing, a long and torturous chapter in California's criminal history finally came to an end. But the damage he caused endured far beyond his final breath. In total, Bonin was convicted of murdering 14 boys and young men, but he claimed responsibility for 21. Authorities suspect the real number may be even higher. His reign of terror left a ripple effect through the lives of countless people. Parents never fully recovered. Siblings grew up in the shadow of grief. Communities bore the scars of fear and distrust that lingered long after his capture. The case exposed major flaws in California's criminal justice system at the time. Bonin had already been incarcerated for sexually assaulting minors and had undergone psychiatric evaluations warning of future violent behavior. Despite this, he was released. The consequences of that decision were devastating. In the years following his execution, lawmakers and advocacy groups pushed for reforms. Discussions centered on how violent sex offenders were evaluated and monitored after their release. Some laws were strengthened, and tracking mechanisms were introduced. But for many, it was too little, too late. Bonin's case also reignited conversations about the nature of evil and how society should deal with individuals who show no capacity for remorse. Was Bonin a product of his upbringing, or simply born monstrous? Psychologists continued to study his case, dissecting his behavior and motivations in an effort to better understand, and perhaps prevent, future crimes. He had endured a violent childhood himself, marked by neglect and abuse. His father was an alcoholic, and Bonin was reportedly molested by both a grandfather and a teacher during his youth. Some argued that these experiences shaped his later sadism. But others countered that many people suffer childhood trauma and do not become murderers. Bonin's choices were his own. The calculated way he stalked and killed his victims suggested a man who enjoyed what he was doing, not someone acting out of damaged impulse alone. Even in death, William Bonin left behind a grotesque legacy. His case has been the subject of documentaries, books, academic journals, and podcasts. He is often mentioned alongside other infamous serial killers from the late 20th century, but what set Bonin apart was not just the brutality, it was the collaboration. The fact that he was able to recruit accomplices and involve others in his crimes horrified the public. He wasn't just a lone predator. He was a manipulator, capable of spreading his pathology to others. The young men and boys he killed were not just numbers. They had names, lives, futures that were stolen. Many were hitchhikers, runaways, or kids from troubled homes, young people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their families spent decades remembering birthdays, anniversaries, and what could have been. For them, Bonin's death was not closure, but it was something close to justice. Decades later, his story still resonates, a dark reminder of what happens when warning signs go unheeded and a predator is allowed to roam free. The Freeway Killer is gone, but the fear he spread and the lives he shattered remain etched into California's collective memory. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. For more content like this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel.